Before President Trump, fake news actually did exist all over the world. Join us as we have a look at some other countries with real fake news problems. Cuba. Now, it's safe to say that Cuba achieved some pretty remarkable feats even under the dictatorship of the two Castro brothers who ruled them. Fidel Castro was hated in certain quarters of the country, while he was also praised in others. But there's no denying that Fidel Castro built a repressive system which would punish all forms of dissent. Though, to be fair, what communist country says, hey, let's all agree to disagree and move on with our lives? Absolutely none! And that's not happening under any dictatorship of any sort. Freedom of speech in Cuba is protected under the Cuban Constitution only if it conforms to the aims of a socialist society. So essentially, Cubans are free to say whatever they'd like, as long as the government likes what's being said as well. Fidel Castro used his power to rule over thousands of journalists and even had human rights activists imprisoned without trial, all because it wasn't the kind of criticism that he wanted to hear. Which means whatever the news organizations would put out to the people was being heavily monitored by the government. Although Cuba was known for their high literacy rates and higher life expectancy rates, that is, unless you disagreed with the government, but compared to wealthier and more industrialized nations, they were doing quite well for themselves even under a communist regime. North Korea. Now, one major red flag that your country probably isn't doing all that great is when your own public officials ignore major warning signs. You know, like the fact that millions of your own people are starving to death. A great famine would fall upon North Korea beginning at the start of the formation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in 1948. North Korean farmlands and the weather conditions were not exactly ideal in order to produce food for the country, but aligning themselves with the Soviet Union, they would be able to get aid as well as imported food along with cheaper fuel. However, what actually happened to the aid ended up being controlled by the government as distributed rations based on political power and not on need. So therefore, those who were most needy, you know, like children and the elderly and anyone who were sick, were actually ignored, while the elites and those loyal to the government were given plenty. However, as the USSR began to crumble, aid to the North Koreans began to stop until there was nothing left. North Koreans are told that they're the wealthiest and most fortunate of all, even though almost 3 million people may have died of starvation in the 1990s, and neighboring South Korea is really one of the wealthiest nations of the world. The way that the Kim family keeps control of citizens is by creating a sealed society where very little information is allowed in or out of the country. Syria. Another country not well known for democracy is Syria. President Bashar al-Assad became the man in charge after his ruthless father's death, and in the early days, there were hopes for a champion of freedom and democracy. With the creation of Syria's first independent newspaper, they began publishing, and things were actually looking well for the country. However, after 1 year in power, everything began to change, and Syria became locked in a vicious and complex civil war in 2012. The Assad regime began to torture and murder prisoners and starve out rebel-held cities. The cost of rebuilding the country was going to be in the excess of $200 billion. And so it would seem that Assad was going down the same path that his father had taken, even though many were hopeful for a brighter future that was full of freedom and democracy. The leader may have just been toying with citizens with the way he forced propaganda on them, all in order to make them think that everything was fine. However, it was actually to find out who were against the regime and who were for it, especially those that were potential political influencers that might have been scheming to rise against him for power. Russia. Do you want to hear a joke that perfectly emphasizes government control in Russia? Well, here's one. In Russia, we have two channels. Channel 1 plays nothing but propaganda. Channel 2 has message saying turn back to Channel 1. Vladimir Putin currently controls all of the media that circulates throughout Russia, and if our reporters in the United States have it right, even some media in other countries. In general, though, the Russian media does portray any news at all from the point of Vladimir Putin himself, explaining everything from an official statement he's made, right down to the state of the nation. Putin already had control of one of 3 stations in Russia, the first being Rossiya 1. Then, after he claimed power, he took control of both First Channel and NTV. That way nothing gets past him. Even for the smaller, independently owned stations, there's an agreement that's made between the Kremlin and the owner, and the editor-in-chief on what may or may not be seen by viewers. In 2016, they passed a law that restricted foreign ownership of media outlets to no more than 20%, which would have been the last resort for any kind of independent journalism in Russia to be owned by foreigners. The media is bought and paid for by the government, which means whatever they want aired gets aired, and that's it. End of story. Iraq. Iraq has had a storied history of being controlled by Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, which severely limited and strictly controlled it. In fact, Iraqi news agency was the one news network that was available, and any other media was actually barred by the government. Satellite dishes were also made illegal because they wanted to keep the country and the citizens from reaching or having knowledge of what was going on outside. There was even a ministry that was put into place in order to control the media, with Tariq Aziz being one of the highest official ministers during Saddam's rule. The country had 5 state-owned daily newspapers, 1 government television channel, and 4 radio stations, using the guise that there were options to get your news, and no laws were put in place to protect the media or the journalists. Even after the regime of Saddam Hussein was split apart, the Iraqi news agency continued to operate as a mouthpiece of the government, but was challenged by an independent news agency called Aswad al-Iraq, backed by the United Nations. Many Iraqis think that the media is using obvious propaganda, and note that it is similar to the style of President Hussein, even though it's being funded basically by a foreign government or multiple at this time. Citizen journalism has become extremely popular in the country, and blogging is a major source of information for people in Iraq and all over the world. So there's a significant amount of information coming from a population who has lived through times when their government was much more censored and has seen what happens when you allow them to have absolute control over your media. The United States. Now, if the United States thought they could get away without at least touching on the fact that 90% of their media is controlled by only 5 corporations, well, they have another thing coming. In 1983, that number was an astounding 50 corporations, but today it's consolidated to a measly 5, all controlling a giant portion of what citizens see on a daily basis. Americans, in retrospect to some of the other countries mentioned about, are giving the illusion of choice when it comes to media. It works much the same way in the grocery store, where massive companies monopolize their markets using different marketing strategies and different labels in order to lure customers into buying their product when they also own 5 or 6 of the other products in that same category. The 5 companies in question are Time Warner, Disney, Murdoch's News Corporation, Bertelsmann of Germany, and Viacom, which was once CBS. The companies have control of anything and everything, including newspapers, books, magazines, radio, and television stations, along with movie studios and online news content. At this point, they're in charge of instilling both the political, economic, social, and moral values of both adults and children in the United States because they have access, along with an ability to be our one news and information source. And with every new administration in the White House, the media deregulation has become more and more lax, beginning with Ronald Reagan and even continuing into the Trump administration. The government has allowed greater media ownership concentration, which basically means that all media in a community and even a city can be owned by a single company without any kind of repercussions. These 5 companies are also in charge of ideas and how foreign policies are shaped. Now, I discussed briefly how media in Iraq works, but we didn't really talk about how it affected the thoughts and ideas of citizens in the US. Saddam Hussein for many years was actually praised by US officials, calling him a stalwart ally during the Reagan administration. The government recognized that Iraq was at a disadvantage in war since Iran had easy access to the Gulf, where Iraq didn't, and so the US government decided to send military aid along with billions of dollars, all in order to fund Saddam Hussein and Iraq in return for oil. But then suddenly Saddam wasn't needed anymore, or perhaps the country was just beginning to run out of its oil supply. Either way, suddenly the media, who had been praising Iraq-US relations, was now making Saddam Hussein out to be a tyrant and a ruthless murderer, as well as a man who possessed an arsenal of weapons of mass destruction. You know, the ones that the United States had most likely provided him with? But all we knew is that Saddam Hussein was the #1 target and his country had to be invaded. Foreign policy is a complex issue and it shouldn't be taken so lightly by the media. But it does raise the question, if the media can so easily sway people into thinking a certain way, then Americans have been listening, reading, and watching fake news for much longer than they could have ever imagined. Many Americans are craving for a significant change. They've been waiting for years and years to find a president that would truly be able to turn the economy around. Someone who can promise significant unconventional changes. Someone who doesn't hold back. A possible underdog that won't screw them over. And someone who's not a corrupt politician. A person who has ideas and stands behind them.